all singing, all dancing, flexible, fluid, multilingual literacy as a social practice tool. So let me start with this somewhat provocative quote by an African social linguist, Busi Makoni. What does this mean? Do African languages not exist? Well, they do. But what this quote is trying to say, that African languages, the big standard languages that we know, Hausa, standard Swahili, Zulu, Xhosa, standard Wolof, are products of a process of standardization, grammatical description and standardization, incorporating a European romantic ideal of language that had its heyday at the moment of colonization, when the descriptions of African languages through colonial administrators, missionaries, linguists started. The standard languages are there, but they do not reflect the full diversity of language use in Africa. We have a model of language that is reflected partly, and to the most part symbolically, in language use in Africa. But there are other ways of thinking of language, of speaking language, and also of writing language that exist. So we need to acknowledge that there are multiple visions of writing. This is an indigenous model of writing that coincides with the colonial period. So this here you see a page of a dictionary of the West African language Bambara, which itself, the named language Bambara, was the creation of a French colonial administrator and linguist, Maurice Delafosse. And Maurice Delafosse worked with a translator, an indigenous translator and linguist, Moussa Travelle, who wrote and published one of the first Bambara dictionaries. May I encourage particularly readers of French to have a go? But so you are now a reader of Bambara. Congratulations. How have you achieved that? What enabled you to know the sound values of the letters and letter combinations? Italian, English. With a background also in Romance languages that does not include Italian but French, I would have pronounced some of the words differently. So for instance here, for what you pronounce as gnon kirini, I would have pronounced nyon kirini. And quand, I would have pronounced kun. Now I'm going to tell you what a French linguist thought of Moussa Travelle's work. Quelle horreur! So basically, what the reviewer is saying, the author doesn't know how to write Bambara, and the value of this book, which he's talking about a book that has Bambara proverbs and a little sketch on traditional law, says the only value of this book is the French translations and the information on customary law. Apart from that, it's very difficult to decrypt the text. The author has simply written his language as he understands it, following French orthographic conventions. A French speaker and a Westerner, right, who does not know the customary law of the Bambara and needs that information.
It's only legible in French.
Indeed. And this is actually a logical contradiction, because that means that a reader of French should be able, actually, to decrypt it quite easily, right, by transferring the existing writing and reading skills. But maybe most importantly, who has the authority to judge? The stance of this review is clearly, I am the linguist, I have the authority, this is a linguist who has worked extensively on Bambara, I have the authority to judge this product. The solution that Moussa Travelle employed was not acceptable to the French linguist, because French linguists and other Western linguists adopted the solution that we all still adopt, the one that is enshrined, hardwired into our brains, standard languages. Because that is the language ideology which we have taken from preschool. And this is the standard language solution for Bambara. Very few Africans are involved in the creation of these standard orthographies. There are some standard orthographies with this strict standard that have been created by Africans, but mainly by Africans that have been trained as missionaries and came to create mini nations based on an association of a language, a standard language and a culture. So for instance, in Nigeria, this has been the case for Yoruba, Crowther, Ajayi in the 19th century. Who reads and writes these literacies today? I can tell you that it's not many people, and these people are mainly Westerners or a very tiny academically trained elite that follows this elite tradition that excludes. However, not all is dire, because there is a treasure trove of really existing yet unrecognized writing. And this writing is really interesting because it's a type of writing that does not negate the standard, because I'm not a revisionist. Colonization has happened, and the standard languages and the colonial policies have been appropriated, transformed to some extent, or creatively resisted. But they only reflect a tiny, tiny little fraction of the really existing linguistic practice. It's this lead language writing where you take your existing literacy skills in one language, the language of first literacy, and you transfer it across board. Ajami, Arabic, character-based writing for African languages is very widespread in Africa. You take the sound letter associations of Arabic, modify them slightly to allow for the different phonological character of West African languages, or neutralize others, and write everything according to these conventions. So again, multilingualism disappears because everything looks as if it is Arabic, and everybody who has been trained in writing Arabic can read and write this. And finally, another West African literacy, Nko, very widespread in the Mande sphere, so Guinea, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, developed in the 1920s by Souleymane Kanté. He was the first actually to describe and integrate into his orthography that most Mande languages are tonal. It's useful to retain at this point that the existing grassroots literacies in Africa mostly follow a lead language model. That is, they are language independent. This is from a Gambian Facebook page. And you see, this would not be so easy for somebody who has not learned how to read and write English. But when you have learned how to read and write English, it's quite easy to read not just the English, but also the bits in African languages that are here. And you also see, of course, that the division between languages has become somewhat obsolete, right? This is a very monolingual way of writing. Just as speech is very often fluid. Here's another example. This is from Senegal. So again, the writing convention is based on French norms. So, Djog Boudiar. Anybody who can read French can read it without even knowing what language it is and what it means. And here another Facebook page. Another widespread idea that also comes from the 19th century, from the creation of nation states based on cultural and linguistic homogeneity. And let's not forget, after Europe had actually killed off most of its minority languages, is this idea that you can territorialize a language so that only one language is the one that has official recognition in an area. And that is important for literacy because most approaches, multilingual approaches to literacy, still somehow are wedded to this thinking, territorial thinking about language. When we talk about mother tongue-based approaches to multilingual education, we still believe that it is possible to pick an area, select a language that belongs to this area that will be taught in schools. And that will be the identity language of most people there, or be understood by most people. Now, if you look at the ethnologue, you cannot help but see that clearly in the most multilingual areas, first of all, even if applicable, this model would lead to a complete balkanization of multilingual literacy is demanding huge resources, but also that it would lock people into tiny local spheres, right? Now we know that writing needs to transcend distance. That's why it was invented as a technology. So even if writing a locally confined language would fulfill important needs of expressing the self in terms of, your symbolic expression of identity, they would not necessarily fulfill your social language needs, and they would not necessarily lead to power and wealth and status. Actually, that would be, the inverse, right? The smaller your language. So, I think we need to let go of this notion of language areas. And I'll give you some examples from my own research area in Senegal, just to put a little bit of flesh on the bones. So I'm leading the Crossroads project, which is on small-scale multilingualism. And we work in Casamance, in an area in southern Senegal. We concentrate on 3 villages. Each of the villages is nominally associated with one language. This language is not even the language that is spoken or claimed by most inhabitants of this area. It is merely the language of the founders and of the male founders. They get the kind of language rights over the place. But if you look at real existing language use, we have 100 hours, 200 participants. In this corpus of observed speech and unobserved speech, we have 20 identified languages. So here you cannot even see the smaller languages. They do not even appear in the pie chart. And what you will see is that Wolof comes in. Of course, Wolof is the biggest language of Senegal and the national lingua franca. You can see French comes in. French is the official language of Senegal. And then you see that the nominal languages of the places also come in, but they're not exclusively used. And in fact, every single conversation has its unique footprint or linguistic profile. So to pick a language in such an environment, which is far from being exceptional in many areas of West Africa, tell me how it's done. And of course, because this challenge exists and is so persistent, it is in fact not done. Nobody selects a language. People shy away from making this choice, which means that the language policy stays in place that favors French, which is taught as if it was a language that was part of the repertoires of children, although they actually are not exposed to it before they enter the classroom and then are supposed to learn basic literacy and numeracy and the language of literacy and numeracy at the same time, without any resources and without qualified teachers. So, what do people do if we set them free from having to choose a language? Well, we started experimenting with this actually when working with transcribers, because you've seen our corpus has 20 languages. Most of these languages are not described, so there is no standard orthography available for them. We linguists, we are the most monolingual people in this entire area, so we are the least qualified to write any of them. So we trained a multilingual transcriber team composed of local inhabitants. And we were brainstorming with them about ways to transcribe. And first we thought, oh, the International Phonetic Alphabet. But we thought then there would be no possible transfer to any practical use of literacy. Then we thought, okay, let's pick the official alphabet of languages of Senegal that allows transfer to the big standard literacies. Although they are hardly ever practiced, they are, at least for Wolof, they are around a little bit. So we used the standard alphabet, but not the special characters that are really attached to particular orthographies for specific languages. And our transcribers then transcribed our whole corpus. are using this alphabet with a lot of variation. You sometimes also see that for French they use orthographic conventions. For French sometimes they don't. We tolerated any variation. We did not correct anything.